My cousin, Mark, has always had a knack for condescension. A city guy through and through, he views anything outside a concrete jungle as quaint, rustic, and ultimately inferior. So, when I inherited my great-grandfather's property, a rambling, overgrown plot of land in rural Alabama, Mark's reaction was exactly what I expected. We were standing in front of the structure that was supposed to be the jewel of the estate, a relic I remembered from childhood summers, the old barn. It wasn't much to look at, weather-beaten, slightly listing to the south, and covered in a thick, almost velvety layer of gray moss and climbing vines. The once bright paint had surrendered entirely to the elements decades ago. "Seriously, Ethan?" he'd scoffed, adjusting his designer sunglasses and wrinkling his nose as if the smell of damp earth offended him personally. "This is what you left New York for? This shack? Look at it. It's just an old wooden barn. You could probably get $10,000 for the scrap wood maybe, but that's it. You've traded a penthouse view for a pigeon roost." I remember smiling faintly, pulling my worn leather gloves tighter. Mark didn't know. He couldn't possibly know. He saw decaying lumber. I saw history, and more importantly, I saw a secret that my great-grandfather, Arthur, had kept hidden for over a century. A secret that centered entirely on the very wood Mark was so casually dismissing. Mark was right in one respect. It was old, but the crucial detail he missed was the kind of wood. The main structural beams, the enormous support posts, and the thick, hand-cut siding were not pine, oak, or any common timber used in Depression-era American outbuildings. They were solid, 150-year-old mahogany. Not the cheap, fast-growing variety imported today, but genuine, dense, old-growth Swietenia macrophylla, the kind that barely exists anymore. Mark, having exhausted his repertoire of insults, turned his attention to the dilapidated farmhouse. "Well, at least the house looks salvageable if you squint and ignore the asbestos warnings," he muttered, walking away. "Let me know when you decide to bulldoze this eyesore. I've got a guy who can haul off the debris for a reasonable rate." I watched him go, a sense of vindication bubbling inside me. Let him think it was debris. Let him think I was a fool for moving back to the sticks. It gave me the head start I desperately needed. My great-grandfather Arthur's will had been clear, eccentric, and utterly binding. To Ethan, I leave the land and the house, and the duty to protect the barn. The wood tells the story. My first week on the property was consumed by the barn. I barely touched the farmhouse. The smell inside the barn was an intoxicating mix of dry hay, old leather, machine oil, and something else. A faint, sweet, almost musky scent that I recognized immediately as aged tropical hardwood. I started the physical labor not with a wrecking ball, but with a fine wire brush and a soft cloth, carefully peeling back the layers of grime and lichen from the interior structural posts. The moment I scraped away the gray film on one of the main corner posts, the wood underneath exploded with color. It was a deep, rich, reddish-brown, luminous and almost iridescent, with an intricate, ribbon-like grain pattern that seemed to shift as I moved. It was unmistakable. It was magnificent. The density was incredible. The posts felt like stone rather than wood. I estimated the 4 main corner posts alone were 18 inches square and over 20 feet tall. Mark's words played back in my head. "It's just an old wooden barn." If he knew what this wood was, he would probably suffer a seizure. Mahogany, especially lumber of this size and age, is essentially illegal to harvest now, and its value is astronomical, often measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single smaller tree's yield, let alone a structure this massive. The mystery deepened the more I explored. How did a small-time farmer in rural Alabama in the late 1800s or early 1900s acquire enough rare imported tropical hardwood to build a barn of this scale? It made no logistical or financial sense. Arthur was a farmer, not a robber baron. I focused on the details. I noticed that every piece of the mahogany structure, the siding, the posts, the beams, was joined with impossibly intricate mortise and tenon joints, held together not by modern screws or bolts, but by thick, hand-carved wooden pegs or trunnels. This wasn't standard construction. It was the work of a master carpenter, possibly a shipwright. The entire barn was assembled like the hull of a colossal ship, inverted and set on a stone foundation. The precision was breathtaking. The joints were so tight you couldn't slip a piece of paper between them, even a century later. I ran my hand over a beam, feeling the incredible smoothness that survived the neglect. It was more than a structure. It was a handcrafted masterpiece. Then, about halfway up the north wall, concealed beneath a loose section of siding I had almost missed, I found the first clue that suggested this wasn't just a valuable material, but a coded message. Engraved deeply into the mahogany, almost disguised by the grain, was a small, crudely drawn symbol. A ship's anchor inside a circle, and underneath it, the date, 1875. I felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. The barn was even older than I thought, and the anchor indicated a direct connection to the sea. My great-grandfather Arthur was born on this property, but his father, Elias, was largely a mystery. All I knew was that Elias had arrived in Alabama around the turn of the century and bought the land. Where did he come from? What did he do before farming? The will said, "The wood tells the story." The mahogany wasn't just the treasure. It was the key to unlocking a hidden family history. This was the start of the deep dive, the start of the real story. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that Mark's derision had been the best possible cloak for the monumental secret I had just uncovered. The old wooden barn was about to talk, and I was going to listen. The anchor was just the beginning of the symbols. The discovery of the anchor symbol and the date 1875 shifted my mission from restoration to excavation. This wasn't just a barn, it was a memorial, a disassembled monument to a past life I knew nothing about. I started working systematically, section by section, wearing a headlamp even during the day, scrutinizing every square inch of the mahogany surface. The smooth, dense wood, while beautiful, was an expert at concealing its secrets. The first symbol was crude, but as I moved to the massive inner crossbeams, I began finding more symbols, etched with incredible precision, almost professional quality, but still deliberately subtle. These weren't graffiti, they were signatures, a language. On one of the central vertical beams, about 10 feet up, I found a sequence of 3 symbols: a stylized compass rose, a single star, and a small, almost invisible E. The E, I quickly theorized, must stand for Elias, my great-grandfather's father, the man who built this place. The compass and the star were clearly maritime signals, reinforcing the connection to the sea. I began taking photos of every symbol, logging their exact location and drawing a detailed map of the barn's interior structure. I needed to see a pattern, a sequence that might reveal a narrative. The overall arrangement felt less like random markings and more like a carefully encrypted index. Why go to all this trouble? If the wood itself was the secret, why engrave it? It felt like a story Arthur wanted to pass on, but only to someone dedicated enough to look past the surface. I spent the next 2 days focused purely on the E-beam. It was the largest continuous piece of wood in the structure, spanning from the foundation to the apex of the roof, and it had a slightly different color variation than the surrounding timber, a telltale sign of an older, potentially salvaged piece. I suspected that the most critical information would be placed here. I tapped along the surface with a small wooden mallet, listening for the subtle change in pitch that signals an empty space. Most of the mahogany gave a solid, deep thud, but near the very base, just above the stone foundation, my mallet produced a higher, hollow tap. My heart rate instantly accelerated. I felt like an archaeologist who had just hit pottery in the desert. The area was cleverly disguised. The joint where the beam met the foundation was surrounded by several smaller, decorative pieces of wood, presumably to cover the slight gap. But upon closer inspection, I realized these were not structural. They were deliberately placed cover plates, held in place not by trunnels, but by incredibly small, old brass pins. Using a delicate dental pick, I carefully pried out the pins, one by one. It took nearly 2 hours of painstaking work to remove all 6. Finally, the cover plate came away, revealing a shallow cavity carved directly into the heart of the 150-year-old mahogany beam. Inside the compartment, nestled in a bed of what looked like desiccated velvet, was a single, rolled-up document. It was brittle, yellowed, and smelled strongly of aged paper and salt water. I carried the document immediately to the farmhouse, laying it out gently on the kitchen table, which was the only flat, clean surface I had access to. The paper was parchment, and the ink was faded, but still legible. It was a handwritten contract, dated April 12, 1888, and signed by Elias Thorne, Shipwright, and a name I recognized instantly from my history classes. Silas Vance, a notorious yet often romanticized figure in maritime history, famous for his privateering and alleged involvement in the illicit trade routes of the late 19th century Caribbean. The document wasn't a contract for construction. It was a deed of transfer. It stated that Vance was transferring a cargo of exotic woods and sundry items to Thorne, in exchange for Thorne's silence and secure temporary storage. The true bombshell was in the final paragraph. It explicitly detailed the origin of the wood. The aforementioned cargo consists entirely of the structural components salvaged from the wreck of the brigantine the Sea Serpent, intentionally scuttled off the coast of Hispaniola in March 1888. The wood, primarily old-growth Brazilian mahogany, is to be reassembled into a land-based structure conforming to the original design blueprints of the ship's hull, to serve as a secure cache for the remainder of the cargo. The Sea Serpent. The ship was famous, or infamous, for disappearing without a trace, along with its immensely valuable, rumored to be stolen contents. And my great-great-grandfather, Elias Thorne, had not only salvaged the structural timbers, but had essentially rebuilt the entire hull as a barn on his property in Alabama, using it as a disguise for a secret cache. The wood wasn't just valuable. It was a monument to a crime, a perfect piece of misdirection. Mark was right. It was an old wooden barn, but it was also a 150-year-old Mahogany Brigantine, rebuilt plank by plank. My ancestors were part of a vast, illicit network, and the barn wasn't a building. It was a meticulously constructed, landlocked coffin for a secret cargo. The contract confirmed my hypothesis. The symbols weren't an index. They were a navigational map, and the barn itself was the chest. My hands trembled as I reread the last line. The cache is secured within the structural heart. Its location is known only to the builder and marked by the Southern Cross. The Southern Cross. I hadn't seen that symbol yet. It was the next clue, and it had to be on the mahogany somewhere. The stakes had just gone from inheriting a valuable structure to unearthing a century-old fortune. The contract was a time capsule, transforming Elias Thorne from a shadowy figure into a resourceful, high-stakes collaborator. He hadn't just bought wood. He had bought into a criminal enterprise and used his shipwright skills to create the ultimate hiding spot. The Sea Serpent was now lying upside down on my property, masquerading as a hay barn. The key to the treasure was the Southern Cross symbol. I returned to the barn, no longer seeing it as merely an architectural challenge, but as a three-dimensional puzzle box. My previous systematic search had failed to locate a prominent Southern Cross symbol. I realized I was looking too broadly. The original symbols, the anchor, the compass, the star, the E, were markers for the narrative. The Southern Cross, being the ultimate locator for the structural heart, had to be different. Smaller, more integrated, perhaps even a functional part of the mechanism itself. I focused on the beams that were the most structurally critical, the ones that would have been the keel and ribs of the brigantine. These were all massive, flawless pieces of mahogany. I shifted my perspective. A shipwright would build a cache to protect its contents from water, heat, and most importantly, prying eyes. The best place for a cache is not the walls, the hull siding, but the floor, the deepest part of the ship's bilge, now the barn's foundation. The current floor of the barn was dirt and packed earth, covered in a century of dried detritus and old straw. But I remembered seeing stone around the perimeter. I began clearing the center area with a rake and a shovel. About 3 feet down, I hit resistance. Not packed earth, but flat stone. Elias had built a deep, thick stone foundation underneath the dirt floor. This was highly unusual for a simple barn, but perfectly logical for a cache requiring absolute stability and protection from moisture. I continued to clear the area, exposing a beautiful, interlocking stone pavement made of dark river rock. As I swept the final layers of dust away, I saw it. Cut into the very center of the largest, flattest stone, the metaphorical center of the keel, was the symbol, the unmistakable 5-star pattern of the Southern Cross. It was so faded by time and abrasion that it was almost indistinguishable from the natural grain of the rock, confirming it was a functional clue, not a casual inscription. The stone marked the spot, but where was the entry? The stone pavement was perfectly seamless, laid like a professional sidewalk. I tried pushing, pulling, and tapping the stone bearing the symbol. Nothing. It was immovable. I began tapping the surrounding stones, searching for another hollow sound, another mechanism. I worked outwards from the Southern Cross stone, and about 6 feet away, I noticed a slight discoloration on the edge of another stone, a faint, almost metallic sheen. I got down on my hands and knees and scraped at it with my knife. It wasn't the stone. It was an incredibly thin brass plate, mortared into the seam between 2 adjacent rocks. It was a hinge, perfectly disguised. The whole section of the stone floor, approximately 4 feet, was a massive lid. The leverage was the problem. These stones were heavy, easily hundreds of pounds each. Elias, a shipwright, would have incorporated a mechanical advantage. I went back to the Southern Cross stone, running my fingers over the etching. The center star was slightly deeper than the others. I pressed on it with my thumb. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible click. Then a small circular depression, no bigger than a silver dollar, opened up on the surface of the stone next to it. It was a keyhole, or rather, a handle aperture. I jammed the hooked end of a heavy antique crowbar I had found in the tack room into the depression, and with a grunt of effort, I pulled upward. The sound of stone grinding on stone echoed through the cavernous barn as the 4-foot section of floor slowly, agonizingly lifted like a trapdoor. Beneath the stone lid, the air that rushed out was stale, cool, and carried a faint scent of metal and cedar. I braced the lid open with a 2x4 and peered down into the darkness. It was a deep, stone-lined well, descending at least 10 feet. This was the structural heart, the bilge of the Sea Serpent, and it was clearly a false bottom to a chamber I couldn't yet see. I climbed down slowly, the walls slick with ancient condensation. The bottom of the stone shaft was paved with rough-hewn cedar planks, not river stone. Cedar, a natural insect and moisture repellent, another brilliant preservation choice. I shone my light around. The entire area was a cramped, perfectly preserved subterranean room, but it was empty, utterly, disappointingly empty. Just the cedar floor, the stone walls, and a faint odor of something long gone. My heart sank. Had someone else found it? Had Arthur cleaned it out? Had the fortune been looted decades ago? Then I remembered the contract. The cash is secured within the structural heart, not on the floor of the structural heart. The cedar floor was the next layer of deception. I started tapping again, the wood giving off the same solid thud as the mahogany. But in one corner, near the wall where the main mahogany beam descended, the sound was different. A lighter, almost rattling tap. The false bottom was concealing another, smaller false bottom. The game was not over. It was just becoming more complex, more personal, and far more frustrating. I knew the treasure was within feet of me, but Elias Thorne, the shipwright, had built an impenetrable fortress of deception. The discovery of the empty chamber, the first false bottom, was a calculated risk Elias Thorne must have anticipated. It was the perfect psychological deterrent, a clear, major discovery that yielded nothing, discouraging further search. But I knew better. The rattling sound in the corner of the cedar floor wasn't the sound of emptiness. It was the sound of a small, loose object resting against a mechanism. I needed to access the space beneath the cedar planks. I studied the cedar floor of the pit. It was laid in a tight pattern, expertly fitted, with almost no discernible seams. I started by removing the loose dirt and dust accumulated in the corner where the sound originated. As I carefully cleared the area, I saw a thin, almost invisible line separating a small section of the cedar planking from the rest. This section was only about 12 inches square, a size too small to house a major treasure, but perhaps perfectly sized for a control mechanism. I needed a way to lift it without damaging the delicate century-old wood. I tried prying it with my knife, but the wood was too hard and the gap too small. I realized Elias wouldn't have used a simple friction fit here. There had to be an internal release triggered from above. I scanned the stone walls of the shaft, tracing the lines of the massive mahogany beam that descended into the pit. Nothing. My eyes kept returning to the rattling corner. The mechanism must be connected to that specific area. I knelt down and pressed my hand firmly against the small square of cedar. As I exerted pressure, I heard a louder, more distinct clunk from underneath the plank. I held my breath, slowly easing my weight onto the panel. Nothing moved. Frustrated, I sat back on my heels. But as my weight left the square, I heard a faint, high-pitched whirring sound, followed by a soft hiss that quickly died out. It was a pneumatic or spring-loaded mechanism that had just been primed and released. The pressure was the key, but I was using it incorrectly. The mechanism didn't open when the weight was applied. It was designed to engage upon the removal of the weight. The rattling sound I had heard initially must have been whatever object Elias had placed there to maintain constant pressure. I quickly scrambled out of the pit and searched the immediate area above. If Elias wanted to keep the mechanism primed, he needed something heavy and unobtrusive. My great-grandfather Arthur's instructions echoed in my mind. The wood tells the story. I looked back up at the mahogany beam I had first scraped clean, the beam marked with the E and the compass. On the interior face of that beam, about 3 feet off the ground, there was a small, perfectly round depression. It was the same size as the stone aperture I had used to lift the 4-foot lid. I realized this was the secondary aperture, but it needed a key, a specific weight, or both. I returned to the empty spot where I had found the contract in Bloco 2. The contract itself had been nested in velvet. I searched the corners of the hidden compartment and found a small, heavy piece of polished lead, perfectly cylindrical, wrapped in the same velvet. It was clearly a counterweight or a plug. I carried it back to the pit and, balancing precariously on the edge, lowered the lead cylinder into the round depression on the mahogany beam. The cylinder slid in with a perfect, satisfying fit, instantly stopping the whirring sound I had heard before. The pressure was now being correctly applied to the mechanism below. I climbed back down into the pit. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. I approached the small square section of cedar planking. I slowly pushed the lead cylinder further into the beam until I felt a firm stop. Immediately, the cedar panel in the floor made a soft, audible thunk and sank about an inch, revealing brass finger slots around its edges. The mechanism had released the lock. Using a thin piece of metal, I carefully lifted the small square panel. Beneath the panel was not more wood or stone, but a heavy, rectangular iron box. It was about 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 8 inches deep, covered in a thick layer of oxidation that had preserved the metal underneath. It was riveted shut and had no visible hinges or openings, only a set of 3 complex rotating dials on the lid, suggesting a combination lock. The box was immensely heavy. I couldn't budge it from its position without risking damage to the delicate cedar floor. I had found the treasure, but it was still sealed, protected by a final layer of Elias Thorne's ingenuity. Now the narrative of the symbols made sense. The anchor marked the barn's origin, the Sea Serpent. The compass and star guided me to the E-beam, Elias's signature, and the location of the first clue, key. The Southern Cross marked the major cache lid. And now, I needed the final hidden instruction, the combination, to unlock the box. Elias wouldn't have left it to chance. The combination had to be written somewhere, probably on the mahogany, hidden in plain sight, encoded using a nautical cipher. I knew the moment I saw the lock. The final secret was not what was in the box, but the sheer, agonizing difficulty Elias went through to keep it safe. The most exciting and nerve-wracking part of the discovery had just begun. The iron box was open, but the prize remained sealed behind a 3-dial combination lock. My initial attempts, using elaborate mathematical ciphers derived from the wood's measurements, had failed. I had approached the problem like a technician, not a storyteller. Elias Thorne, the shipwright, was a man of the sea, of instinct and history, not complex arithmetic. The key had to be simpler, a clue hidden in the shared cultural memory of sailors. I climbed out of the pit, defeated, and began pacing the dusty floor of the barn. I needed to reset my mind, to think like a man rebuilding his ship on land, giving it a new purpose. What is the most fundamental, universally known piece of information to a 19th century mariner? Not complex dimensions, but the constants of navigation. The stars, the tides, the magnetic north. I returned to the E-beam, the centerpiece of Elias's code. My eyes kept lingering on the three original symbols: the compass rose, the star, and the E. I realized the problem wasn't the numbers I was deriving, but the source itself. The combination wasn't built from the measurements. It was the measurements, only expressed in a unit I had overlooked. I ran my hand over the symbols one more time, and I noticed something I had missed entirely in my rush. The engraving tool had been run slightly deeper at 3 specific points, creating tiny, almost imperceptible nicks, each one next to a symbol. These were points of reference. I took my measuring tape and carefully measured the distance from the bottom of the E to the highest tip of the compass rose, the first and last symbols in the sequence. It was exactly 72 inches. I felt a sudden jolt. 72 inches is 6 feet. This was not a random measurement. It was the 6-foot waterline, a common and critical marking on any vessel, dictating its depth and stability. I had the unit, feet. Next, I measured the distance between the two most prominent symbols, the star and the compass rose. The measurement was 27 inches. 27 inches is $2 frac feet, not an integer. My heart sank again. Elias was playing a different game. It wasn't about simple conversion. It was about significance. I sat back, running my fingers through my hair. The 3 symbols, the compass rose, navigation, the star, direction, and the E, Elias. I took the 3 integers I had found earlier, the most critical and repeated measurements in the structure, but instead of reducing them, I treated them as an index to a different, pre-existing numerical sequence. I remembered a conversation with Arthur when I was a child. He'd always told me that every captain lives and dies by the 3 dates: the day he ships out, the day he makes port, and the day he finds true north. Date 1, the day Elias shipped out, contract signed, April 12, 1888. Date 2, the year of the barn's construction, engraving on anchor, 1875. Date 3, true north. The magnetic declination in the 1880s for this part of Alabama was approximately 2.5 degrees east, a number too complex. The key had to be simpler. I went back to the 3 integers I got from the most significant structural measurements: the height, width, and length of the entire structure, which I now realized were simply the most stable, unchanging numbers on the property: 27, 33, and 60 feet. I looked at the 3 dials on the iron box. They were old, tarnished, but I could make out faded Roman numerals scratched onto the metal face around the dials. They were marked I, 2, and 3. This implied an order. The order of the code, I realized, was the inverse of the measurement: length, then width, then height. The 3 dimensions of the structure itself, but read backward. 3, length, 60 feet. Elias would reduce this to the single, most critical digit: 6 plus 0 to 6. 2, width, 33 feet. 3 plus 3, 46. I, height, 27 feet. 2 plus 7, 49. The sequence was 669, the barn's code, the opposite of its creation. I climbed down again, my heart hammering a new rhythm against my ribs. I reset the dials one last time. I turned the first dial, the one marked I, to 6. The second dial, marked 2 to 6. The third dial, marked 3 to 9. I held my breath. Silence. Then a shuddering clunk-click that sounded like a gun cocking. The iron box's front panel sprang open, revealing its contents. It was not a mountain of jewels, nor was it a handful of gold doubloons. It was something far more historically compelling and personally valuable. Nestled on a bed of dark, perfectly preserved silk were 2 items: a heavy, beautifully tarnished brass ship's chronometer, still ticking, its internal mechanisms a century-old marvel of accuracy, and a single, thick, leather-bound ledger. The chronometer was the proof of the Brigantine's identity, the time capsule of its final moments. But the ledger, bound in what looked like sharkskin, held the true story. I carefully lifted it out of the box, the dry air of the pit rushing to meet the ancient paper. The first page was titled, "The Accounting of the Sea Serpent, the Final Voyage." My ancestor, Elias Thorne, had not just salvaged a ship. He had saved its entire explosive history. This was the final critical piece of the puzzle, and the moment I knew the story I had found was far bigger than a simple inheritance. The mahogany secret was about to be revealed. I held the ledger, the final piece of Elias Thorne's century-old puzzle. The iron box lay open, revealing the chronometer ticking with an impossible accuracy, but the real gravity of the situation was bound within the sharkskin cover. This ledger wasn't just a record, it was a confession and a testament. I gently opened the cover. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was elegant, steady, and clear. The first page wasn't an accounting of gold, but an inventory of people. It was a complete manifest of the Sea Serpent's crew and passengers, detailing their roles and, more crucially, their personal effects. The ledger wasn't about stolen treasure, it was about stolen lives. The second page, written in a different, more panicked hand, was an account of the Brigantine's final hours, penned by Silas Vance himself. Vance admitted that the ship hadn't been scuttled due to a storm or privateering, but by his own hand, to prevent the seizure of the cargo by a larger pursuing British naval vessel. But the cargo wasn't the gold rumored in the history books. The real cargo was immensely valuable trade goods, raw silk, rare indigo dye, and a cache of uncut Caribbean diamonds that Vance had acquired through illegal back-channel deals. The true secret, however, was revealed on the third page, penned by Elias Thorne. He detailed the agonizing 4-week process of salvaging the Brigantine's structure. Elias, a man of deep moral conviction, realized that Vance intended to simply abandon the bodies of the deceased crew and passengers trapped below deck. Thorne's decision was immediate and profound. He didn't just salvage the mahogany, he painstakingly disassembled the Brigantine piece by piece, bringing every structural element and every single body back to the Alabama coast, disguised under the cover of night. This wasn't a crime cache, it was a mausoleum. The structure, the mahogany barn, was not merely a hiding place for stolen wealth, but a sacred, reconstructed coffin for the lost souls of the Sea Serpent. Elias used the mahogany, the eternal wood that shipwrights knew would last for centuries, to rebuild the hull on land, ensuring the structure itself was the tomb. The central cavity, where I found the box, was not for gold, but to hold the personal effects and the manifest, acting as a permanent record of those who perished, providing their families with the proof of their end. The combination was the key to their final, resting place, allowing a future generation, me, to finally reveal the truth. I quickly flipped through the rest of the ledger. The last pages contained a detailed map of the barn's foundation, marking specific coordinates. These coordinates didn't point to more hidden gold. They pointed to the exact location of the 10 most prominent crew members, whose remains Elias had carefully interred beneath the surrounding stone foundation. He had buried them in the bilge of their final landlocked ship, protecting them with the heavy stone I had just uncovered. The true fortune wasn't in diamonds or gold. It was in the mahogany itself, which Elias had bequeathed to my great-grandfather Arthur, instructing him never to sell it, but to guard the secret until the world was ready. The material wealth was a protective layer for the moral wealth, the lives saved from obscurity, and the story preserved. Mark's scoffing words returned to me one last time. "It's just an old wooden barn." I looked at the chronometer, still ticking, 130 years later, marking the time since the Sea Serpent vanished. I realized my inheritance wasn't just a property, it was a sacred trust. I had the duty to protect this truth, to honor the memory of the deceased, and to ensure that the magnificent mahogany structure, the landlocked Brigantine, remained standing as a permanent memorial to Elias Thorne's moral courage and the lost souls of 1888. The mystery was solved, the history was recovered, and the old wooden barn had finally told its story. And it was a much richer story than any gold could have provided.